So good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 11 of the hearings here in Epping Forest, including to anyone observing in the council chamber. So it's 9:30 and today's hearing is now open. Can everybody hear me? Thank you. So for anybody who's not been here before, my name is Louise Phillips, and I'm the inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the Epping Forest District Local Plan. The programme officer, who everyone will have met by now, is Louise St John Howe. So a few housekeeping matters to begin with. If anyone with a mobile phone could please switch it off or turn it to silent, and I'll come straight to the council to remind us of the fire procedures and the bathrooms. Thank you.
There's no planned fire alarm today, so if we hear the fire alarm, we need to exit following the signs, either the way you came in, or if that area is blocked behind me, through the doors and down the stairs, and assemble on the green towards the Harlow direction. The toilets are located on the stairwells.
Thank you. So, as you know, the sessions this week are starting at 9:30, with the afternoon sessions starting at 2 o'clock. We'll take a mid-morning break this morning and a mid-afternoon break if we're still sitting by then this afternoon. A reminder to everybody present that the meeting is being broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of subsequent repeated viewing, with copies of the recording being made available upon request. So by being present in this meeting, it's likely that the recording cameras you see here will capture your image, and your image will become part of the broadcast. You should be aware that this may infringe your human and data protection rights, and if you have any concerns about this, then please speak to the webcasting officer to my left. We have a microphone system here today, which is very important for the broadcast. So if you could press your button when speaking and then turn it off afterwards, please. Unless there are any immediate questions, I'll ask for everybody around the table to introduce themselves, please, beginning with the council. Thank you.
Good morning, Madam. My name is Mark Beard. I'm a barrister instructed by the solicitor to the council on behalf of the Local Planning Authority. Representing the council today and speaking in the first session is Ms. Alison Blom-Cooper. To her right will be Miss Chloe Salisbury from Arup, and to her right, Mr. David Coleman from the council.
Carrying on, please.
David Sprunt from Essex County Council, leading on transportation issues.
Good morning. Rich Cook, Planning Service, Essex County Council.
Morning. Neil Osborne, DLP Planning for the Farmers Club Charitable Trust with interests at Waltham Abbey.
Good morning. Rachel Bryan from Saunders on behalf of Mr Eldred, North Weald Site R1.
Good morning. Claire Hutchinson on behalf of Mrs Bridget Uncle, landowner of sites SHRR1 and SHRR3.
Francesca Hill from Saunders, representing Mr Graham Watt, who has some rural employment sites.
Mary Dowd, Ongar Neighbourhood Plan Community Group, and also representing Ongar Town Council.
Good morning, I'm Stephen Kosky from Turley, representing LF Waltham Abbey Limited for site land south of Upshire Road.
Good morning, Madam. Jeremy Dagley, Head of Conservation at Epping Forest for the Conservators of Epping Forest.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that. Does anyone have any general questions before we turn straight to the agenda? No, thank you. So as you know, over the course of the next 3 days this week, we're here to discuss the places, policies and the sites that are allocated in the plan. Loughton, as everybody knows, will be discussed separately, and I should just say that that's for timing reasons rather than anything else, and that's in order to be able to give Loughton a full session. So that everybody knows where I stand in terms of site visits, I've been to some but not all of the sites already. I will go to all of the places in the plan. I haven't been to them all already, but I won't necessarily go to every single allocated site. In terms of the places that are to be discussed today, Waltham Abbey and Epping, I've been to both of those, and I've had a reasonable look around both of those. So that's just where I stand with the site visits. If people feel very strongly about particular sites that I haven't seen, then obviously that will come up through the hearings, and I'll know to go and have a look at those. But there's a lot of places to go, and some of them I'm trying as far as I can to get to everywhere before the relevant hearing, but that might not be possible depending on how long we go on in the evening. But I will make sure I've been everywhere before I form any final conclusions. So this morning we're discussing issue 1, our policies P1 to P15 justified, effective and consistent with national policy in general terms, and also the Waltham Abbey policy. So we'll move straight on to that issue 1. And question 1, which I intend to take all together largely, is would it be justified for Appendix 6 to have policy status? And the Council has provided this morning a list of amendments that it intends to make that we can discuss today in relation to Appendix 6. So if I just run through briefly the sort of the bullet point questions that I have, I'll ask the Council then, first of all, to take us through perhaps its intended amendments and to answer the questions that I've set, and then we'll go around the table and take comments on any of those before coming back to the Council. So I've asked, does Appendix 6 contain essential or desirable requirements? So if Appendix 6 were to become policy, would everything therefore in it become essential, and are all of the requirements therefore feasible? Is Appendix 6 consistent with the plan itself? A particular issue that's been raised is the dwelling numbers are given as approximate figures in the plan, whilst the appendix sets minimum capacities, and then there are other areas to do with mapping, etc. Relevance to master plan areas and designated employment areas. Now, I know that the Council's obviously proposing some amendments in relation to those. The basic question there is it appropriate to include things in Appendix 6 if no specific policy requirements are set in Appendix 6? And then obviously I have on my list here proposed modifications to Part A, and this was to clarify essentially that the requirements in Part 6 would constitute policy requirements. So if I could ask the Council to address those points first of all, and as we go around the table, something I suppose I have in my mind is that if anyone is objecting to Appendix 6 becoming policy, if all of the points here could be addressed and it could be made consistent and some of the sort of amendments were helpful, is there any reason why it shouldn't become policy? It seems the Council had intended that it would be. So if I move on to the Council now, please.
Thank you, Madam. Can I just check, would you like us to set out our rationale for why we think it is justified to have Appendix 6 as policy to set the... Okay. So the Council is of the opinion that it's justified for Appendix 6 to have policy status, and that we consider is consistent with paragraph 157 of the National Planning Policy Framework, which states that crucially local plans should allocate sites to promote development and flexible use of land, bringing forward new lands where necessary, and provide detail on form, scale, access and quantum of development where appropriate. In addition, paragraph 154 of the NPPF states local plans should set out the opportunities for development and clear policies on what will or will not be permitted and where. Only policies that provide a clear indication of how a decision maker should react to a development proposal should be included in the plan. And the planning practice guidance on plan making references paragraph 002, and the ID is 61-002-2019-0315, states that where sites are proposed for allocation, sufficient details should be given to provide clarity to developers, local communities and other interested parties about the nature and scale of development. So the site descriptions and development requirements in Appendix 6 complement the policies P1 to P15 and provide additional detail to guide the preparation of planning applications and clear policy requirements for decision makers. Those site-specific policy requirements have been informed by the Council's evidence base, which includes the Site Selection Report, EB 805, the Infrastructure Delivery Plan, which is EB 1101, and the Habitat Regulation Assessment, EB 209, amongst other documents. and those provide clarity and further detail on the matters set out in paragraphs 154 and 157, which I've mentioned, and the PPG. And they provide a mechanism to ensure that all the development proposals that come forward are acceptable in planning terms. So it's always been the Council's intention that Appendix 6 would form part of policy for policies P1 and to P15. And to that end, we're proposing an amendment to Part A, policies P1 to P15, as confirmed in the Matter 15 hearing statement on page 3, paragraphs 1 and 2, and Amendment 1 on the schedule, which, as you say, we've prepared to kind of aid discussion today. To remove the ambiguities regarding its policy status and to correct the typographical error, we are proposing to amend the document title for Appendix 6. And if you look at Amendment 2, to read site-specific policy requirements and designations, and I'll come on to the designation point in a bit. So the content of Appendix 6 isn't included within Chapter 5, basically in order to ensure the legibility of the local plan submission version, with the policies outlining development requirements for each settlement, and then Appendix 6 outlining the development requirements for each of the sites. And that is in order to make the document more manageable and readable. Turning to whether it's essential or a desirable requirement, whether they are essential or desirable is dependent on the language which has been used to identify the requirements, and should be cross-referenced against the relevant policies which are set out in the local plan submission version. So where development proposals will or must provide specific requirements, these are considered to be essential, and where development proposals use the word should incorporate specific requirements, those are considered to be desirable or aspirational. So the description of the development requirements for each site is therefore considered clear in terms of whether these are essential or desirable. Turning to the point about the consistency with the plan itself and dwelling numbers, and we note the other hearing statements that have been submitted, and acknowledge that there have been some inconsistencies with the local plan submission version and Appendix 6, and Council will undertake a check to ensure that consistency is ensured. But with regard to the dwelling numbers, the minimum capacities used for the strategic master plan areas with approximate capacity for individual site allocations. This is to provide a level of flexibility to enable acceptable and viable proposals to be brought forward on each site. Individual sites which are smaller in area with less flexibility to configure the design to overcome site constraints have an approximate quantum for delivery stated. The development capacity of strategic master plan areas has more scope as part of a master planning exercise to meet minimum requirements for the site, and therefore a minimum quantum is stated for those.
Sorry, so just to clarify that, the intention is that in for the master plan areas, it's intended to be minimum.
Yep. And approximate for the other sites because they're smaller and more detailed work needs to be done to satisfy ourselves, so they're approximate.
Okay, and is the plan and the appendix consistent in how it refers to those?
I think we have noticed there are a number of inconsistencies, and as I say, we will undertake a check to ensure that there is consistency between the plan and the Appendix 6 with regards to those housing numbers.
Okay.
But that was the intention.
Okay, thank you.
Turning to the relevance to master plan areas and designated employment areas, the detailed development requirements for the master plan areas are included in Chapter 5 of the local plan submission version. For clarity and to ensure consistency with the format that was used for the Garden Town communities in policy SP4, the Council proposes to remove the maps of the master plan areas in Appendix 6 for the places policies and relocate those into the Chapter 5 of the local plan submission version, and that will ensure that there is consistency with that adopted for the Garden Town communities. Turning to the employment sites, the local plan submission version designates a number of existing employment sites and also proposes a number of new employment site allocations. Currently, Appendix 6 includes pro formas for both existing designated employment sites and new employment site allocations. However, site-specific requirements are only provided for the new employment site allocations. So, as set out in Appendix B of the Council's Matter 12 hearing statement, which is for the employment session, the Council proposes a number of amendments to make it clear the difference between designated employment sites and employment site allocations, and those are amendments 6 and 7 on the schedule. For clarity and in accordance with policy policy E1, parts A and B, the Council proposed to amend the layout of Appendix 6 so that the designated employment sites are still contained within the appendix, but in a separate section to make it clear that they're just plans which show where the designated employment sites are, but don't have any site requirements. So just to clarify, we have added all those proposed amendments to this schedule just to make it clear.
Thank you. Anyone else have any comments about Appendix 6? Ms. Bryan.
Thank you. I've got a couple of points. First, a question. Does Amendment 4 mean there will be no Appendix 6 for the master plan areas? Because at the moment, Appendix 6 only contains, for North Weald Bassett, it only contains the master plan map. If that's going to be moved to the place policy, does that mean there'll be no Appendix 6?
There'll be no Appendix 6 in relation to the North Weald Master Plan area. The map will be with the policy and the requirements which are set out in the policy for the Master Plan area. And the intention is just to bring them together and make it consistent with policy SP4.
Do you have any concerns about that proposal?
No, I'm happy with that, but I did have another point about the approximate versus minimum requirement. My concern is that, because at the moment we've got the policy saying the sites should be approximate, and we've just heard from the council that the master plan areas are minimums. I'm just wondering how this will work in practice, given the sites are in separate ownerships. What if early applications came through for approximate numbers and for whatever reason that was, those sites delivered lower numbers, would the later applications be required to take up the shortfall? I'm imagining a scenario where one of the larger sites comes forward first and you're left with, because the sites in North Weald range from sort of 30 hectares to 2 hectares, and if a 2 hectare site is expected to make up the shortfall, that might be quite difficult to achieve, particularly to be in accordance with the council's density policies and design policies elsewhere. So yeah, feedback on that, thank you.
Do you want to come back on that?
Yes, I think that's why we've established master plans for those areas, and the master plan process will be partly to establish where development and the quantum of development goes on those sites. And that's what we have worked towards around the Statement of Common Ground for the North Weald sites in order to ensure that.
So, sorry, just to take North Weald Bassett as an example, so page 143 of the plan. Is it the council's intention to alter the text in Part B? If the intention is for a minimum number of homes to apply to the master plan areas, policy Part L of the policy states a minimum of 1,050 homes, but then Part B for each of the component parts talks about approximately a number of homes. Would it be the council's intention to make sure that Part B required a minimum number for each site? I think is that the point you're querying, Ms. Bryan? Would the minimum apply to each component part or just to the master plan area as a whole?
No, we're comfortable that the master plan area can achieve the minimum number. How it's configured within the sites, we think there's approximate numbers about how it might be from the initial work we've done, but as I say, we would expect that to come through the master plan process, an agreement about which sites are bringing forward what quantum of development.
Ms. Bryan.
So I just wanted to clarify I understood that correctly, that the master plan area will say minimum, but still within policy P6 it will say approximate for the sites, because that's consistent with what's in the statement of common ground. It says approximate. And so amendments 1 and 2, those, it says here they apply to policies P1 to P15. That wouldn't apply to the master plan areas because there is no Appendix 6.
That's correct.
Thank you, Ms. Bryan. Ms. Hutchinson.
Thank you. It's a simple point on consistency. Taking my client's site, SHR-R1 as an example, there are a number of requirements that simply repeat the wording of the DM policy and translate that into Appendix 6. As a result of the changes that were modifications that were made in the DM hearings, there is inconsistency between the wording in the policy, and obviously some elements are still to be examined. So there's information in regard to access and public rights of way, which is T1, so there may be amendments for that. So it's a consistency point. On the wider point of whether Appendix 6 is required for these smaller sites, such as my client's site, there seems to be a lot of repetition, and to what extent it's necessary or desirable to have that repetition, it seems unclear. But so I suppose from my perspective, so long as there is consistency, then it doesn't detract from or create confusion, but it does seem somewhat unnecessary, and will probably be clearer if everything was in, for the smaller sites, a policy in the plan itself.
We just hear from Mr. Osborne, and then we'll ask the council to come back on that. Mr. Osborne.
Thank you. I think the direction of travel seems to be that Appendix 6 should be part of the policy, and I'm entirely agnostic about whether it should be or not. Be perfectly happy to support it being within the policy, and therefore it needs to fulfil a proper policy function. In that context, I can welcome the proposed amendments that the Council have suggested, but I do have concerns that some of the descriptive parts of Appendix 6 as it stands at present are very loose in terms of what should be in a development plan policy, and I think that's probably what caused you to raise the question in the first place. To give an example, if I may, on WAL E6, which is the Galley Hill employment land allocation at Waltham Abbey, under the heading infrastructure, the first sentence is the site has potential site access constraints.
Sorry. Just want to give us a page number.
Indeed, that is Appendix 6. It's the second page. It's page 85, so second page of Wells E6.
Thank you. Carry on.
So, yes, under the subheading infrastructure, the site has potential site access constraints. Well, I think the policy should be definite. Either it has access constraints or it doesn't have access constraints, because if it does have access constraints, the policy ought to be prescribing what the developer should do about them. So the second sentence says development proposals should consider the need to upgrade or widen Galley Hill Road. They're considered. Nothing more needs to be done. That's not, in my view, rigorous enough for a development plan policy. So my point generally with that one example, and there are others I could point to, is that actually some more revisions are needed to Appendix 6 to make Appendix 6 viable policies which the public and the developer can follow.
Thank you. When you're ready, could I ask the council to come back on the points made by Ms Hutchinson concerning, first of all, the consistency if amendments are made to DM policies, and also whether for the smaller sites it leads to repetition, and then Mr Osborne's point. Thank you.
Yes, if I can deal with the consistency point, obviously we recognise there will be issues as a result of changes that have been proposed to the main policies in the plan. And that we will need to do a consistency check to ensure that the policy requirements in Appendix 6 are consistent with the policies in the plan. And we will endeavour to do that when the hearing sessions are finished and we know what the overall scale is. In terms of putting the development requirements into the Appendix 6, I think it is helpful for the smaller sites to bring together the key policy requirements for individual sites, and it does provide greater clarity for developers, members of the public alike, to know what the council's expectations are and what the key planning considerations, material planning considerations will be for that site. So it helps the decision makers too. So whilst it might be repetitive, I think as long as it's consistent, then there is benefit to it for the wider community. Turning to Mr Osborne's point, it was intended to be helpful to address the issue around the particular Galley Hill access point, and it came from our colleagues at Essex County Council and the Highway Local House Authority being concerned about that and wanting that to be explored. So again, it was flagging up an issue that needed to be considered and properly addressed as part of any proposal being brought forward.
And on the more general point, is that a sort of a legitimate role for policy to flag up issues that need to be considered rather than being definite and prescriptive about things that need to be addressed?
I think we'd be happy to make it more definite in the sense of saying that the access arrangements need to be properly and adequately considered as part of any planning proposal brought forward. If the conclusion is that something isn't required as a result of further work, then so be it. But we're happy to tighten it up if that's helpful.
Mr Dagley.
Thank you, Madam. Just on that particular point on the Galley Hill Road, so the same pages that we've just been discussing, I should remark that that part of the road is bounded by forest land, which is protected by the 1878 Act, the Epping Forest Act of 1878. So that's inalienable land all the way up the side of that road. So it's an issue which is not highlighted or flagged up. So those constraints are not just mere constraints of width. Thank you, Madam.
Ms Bryan.
Sorry, me again. It's just occurred to me that concept framework areas haven't been mentioned in these amendments, and they have the same inconsistency between approximate and minimum as the strategic master plans, and I was just wondering what the intention was, the Ongar in West Ongar in particular. There is sort of quite a lot of additional information in Appendix 6, which appeared to be desirable rather than essential, and this minimum versus approximate inconsistency.
I think in relation to the approximate and minimum, the same applies in terms of developing the concept framework and using the approximate for the whole area and or the minimum for the whole area and the approximate for the individual site allocations. We hadn't intended to move that from the Appendix 6 into the main body of the plan, but obviously that is an option that we could consider.
Sorry, could you just clarify the intention around the concept frameworks? Is the same intended to apply as the master plan areas, or?
The same difference between approximate and minimum applies. There are, I suppose, a slightly lighter touch master plan, and if you look at the note that we prepared for our cabinet in October last year, it was Appendix 4. I can get you the reference. I haven't got it to hand, I'm afraid. But that sets out how we imagine concept frameworks will go through the process, and there is a slightly lighter arrangement for them than compared to the master plan process. So they fall in between an individual site and a master plan area. They're smaller areas. But I think the same applies in terms of a minimum number for the concept framework area and an approximate number for the sites within it.
How about in terms of how the whether they appear in Appendix 6 or not? Can you just remind me of that? Are the requirements in Appendix 6 or are they in Chapter 5?
They're in Appendix 6.
They're in Appendix 6, so that, and it would intend that they remain in Appendix 6. Mr. Dagley, did you have anything further this time? No, sir. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Anything else on Appendix 6? Stad.
Sorry, did the council answer the situation with regard to the concept frameworks? I beg your pardon. Did the council answer the question about desirable versus essential with relating to the concepts, and in particular West Ongar concept, please? Because there are quite a lot of desirable situations there, including access.
I think we answer that in terms of the general point about the use of language, and when something is essential or desirable has been differentiated by the use of the language in the requirements that have been set out. I think my colleague has just outlined that currently those are set out in Appendix 6, but we could move them into the main body of the plan if that was considered appropriate.
Well, I'd be interested in your view as to whether it matters particularly. I think if Appendix 6 were to become policy, I don't think it necessarily matters exactly where the policy is set out. If we're going to raise, I think the council's also said that one thing it will look to do is to firm up the wording in Appendix 6 as to things that must be considered in order before any application is granted. I think if you've got any detailed comments about particular requirements in relation to particular sites, then we'll discuss those in the site-specific sessions. So yes, I think my current thinking, and given what I've heard here, is that you should work on the basis of making the amendments to make that policy. Make it clear that it would be policy. Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to question 2 on the agenda, which is the application of the infrastructure requirements clauses which appear in each of the place-specific policies. the question I've asked on the agenda is, as written, do they suggest that every development, and I've said much, but must contribute towards every item listed? And again, this is a general question at this stage. If you're concerned about specific items of infrastructure and specific settlements, then save that for the place-specific session, please. And the council, I think, has confirmed that the requirements, it's not supposed to be the case that every development must contribute towards every item. I think that's the council's position, but I think that the wording does suggest that every development in each settlement, whether for housing or employment, should contribute towards all of the items listed. The wording used, for example, is specifically development proposals in Epping will be expected to contribute proportionately towards the following items. And then you get development proposals must contribute. The council will only permit applications. So it's that kind of wording, I think, that people have raised. And so I guess my question is, should the sections, if it's the intention that you won't necessarily every development have to contribute towards every item, should the sections be reworded somehow to clarify this, and that contributions towards the items will be required where necessary, etc. If we come to the council first, and then make any comments.
Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Madam. As you've just summarised, the council does not believe that, or certainly does not intend that that's the case, that every development must contribute towards every item. As you've said, that's set out in our Matter 14 hearing statement, paragraphs 5 to 8. In order to establish whether and what infrastructure is required, a prospective developer will be required to consult both the local plan submission version, relevant policies set out within it, and the infrastructure delivery plan or plans that exist, and that will help to establish which items of infrastructure might be required as part of their scheme, or which schemes they may be required to contribute towards. Specific requirements will then be established through discussion at the pre-application or strategic master planning stage or concept framework stage with the council, and where appropriate also discussions with infrastructure providers. So the council considers that the infrastructure requirements clauses in chapter 5 and throughout the plan already make this sufficiently clear, and the intention is very much that the council will only request obligations in accordance with the tests in paragraph 204 of the MPPF. Thank you.
Sorry. Ooh. Sorry, wrong button. I know that these are things that people have raised in statements, so the wording that I read out, some participants and some representatives have taken issue with the wording that, so if we look at Epping, for example, as it's the first policy, that's the only reason to look at Epping. And then so Part D, specifically development proposals in Epping will be expected to contribute proportionately towards the following infrastructure items. They are listed there. And then Part E, development proposals must contribute proportionately towards the delivery of those items set out above. And the wording isn't quite the same in each of the policies, but I think it's the word sort of must. I accept what you're saying. It's clear from what you've said what the intention is, but it's whether the policy wording as written states something more than that. Perhaps before you come back to it, if I see what other people think around the table and whether you share that concern or not, essentially. So, Mr. Osborne.
Yes, do share that concern, because at some point some lawyer is going to get to grips with it and is going to say, well, you know, that might be the council's intention, but that is actually what it says, and what it says is important, overridingly important. The solution, of course, if we're going along the route that Appendix 6's policy, is to completely redraft the Appendix 6 text, to make clear what the council's aspirations are and make clear what is a requirement on each and every site. And that's the best way of dealing, in short, with the infrastructure requirements for for sites to distinguish between residential and employment and other development allocations. So we've got the bones of a workable plan here, but it needs a little bit more work from the council, I think. Now, how you then take that forward in terms of the degree of change that the plan needs to make it a sound plan will be up to you, Mum. But we can get there, but not in the way that the council have currently phrased the key policies.
Ms Bryan.
Yes, I share the same concern, and particularly in relation to North Will Bassett, it's part F which says will be expected, and part G which says the council will only permit, is the wording in particular I'm concerned about. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Hutchinson.
Thank you. Agree again with the previous speakers. There is a concern that the policy wording currently clearly states that the plan envisages that those items are currently required, and whilst Part F, which not as Part F of the policy I'm concerned, which is P12, but whilst there is provision in the place policies for further discussion, the wording implies that those items are required now, and I think that's a lack of clarity for communities. And there's also a potential issue of those requirements or that policy wording being translated into neighbourhood plans that could cause clarity issues at a later date. I mean, for the smaller sites, one option. For the larger sites, there might need to be a different approach, but for the smaller sites, one option is merely to indicate that infrastructure requirements should be delivered at a rate and scale to meet the needs that arise from the proposed development in accordance with Policy D1, rather than seek to list out or pre-guess what may or may not be required when applications come forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Hill.
Thank you. I concur with the comments that have already been made, and particularly given the wording clarifications that the Council gave when we were discussing the first Appendix 6, where they said will and must will mean essential and should would be desirable, which suggests that, as worded at the moment, it's all essential in order to be acceptable to the Council. And as others have said, at this point, not all of these infrastructure requirements have been properly tested. The IDP is moving feast, and not all will be necessary for each development. Thank you.
Stad.
Yes, my concern is that Ongar is predominantly small sites, and the essential open space requirements of 14 hectares. Those can't possibly be situated and not desirable on the sites chosen. And what mechanism is going to be in place about, I know one of the policies said that they will consider buying other land, but it is all rather woolly and needs a bit more clarification. My concern is that because they're small sites, they will actually not provide much towards the essential infrastructure.
Thank you. Mr Cook.
Thank you. Yes, my point has been alluded to very briefly so far by the previous speakers, but that is about the point of the relationship and consistency with the overarching infrastructure requirements policy, that is Policy D1. The position of the County Council with that policy is that we've been pretty satisfied with it. We feel that it does a good job. We feel it's been carefully drafted. It's fairly comprehensive and quite tightly honed. Our concern would therefore be if changes to these other policies and requirements were to undermine the requirements of Policy D1. So I think that it's a critical point, however this is dealt with and addressed in these individual policies, that we ensure consistency with Policy D1.
Mr Dagley.
Thank you, Madam. I just wanted to make a point which we make in our most recent Matter 1 statement on page 9 of that, paragraph 16, just in relation to the balance between the zone of influence and the division of that at the moment in the plan between 0 to 3 kilometres and 3 to 6.2, and also the division of SANGs and SAMs, the Sustainable Alternative Natural Green Space contributions, or the on-site management. it's not clear how those are split between different developments of different sizes. The other key issue, I think, is that's the main issue, I think, that I wanted to highlight. So there was one other thing I was going to raise, which sorry, I'll come back to that. Sorry, thanks, Madam.
Thank you. Thank you. So if I could come back to the council on the general points first. So there's obviously concern raised around the table about the strength of the wording, and then the other, I guess, more fundamental question that's been raised is whether there's a need to list specific items of infrastructure in the place policies as you have them here, or whether they should be left to the IDP or Appendix 6 or covered in more general terms by policy D1. I mean, you might want to come back on this again, Mr. Cook, but perhaps if the council could just come back on those points first of all.
Thank you, Madam. If I could...
Sorry, Mr. Coleman, to interrupt, and maybe you could explain the sort of reason for listing specific items of infrastructure in the place policies, but not necessarily all of them.
Okay. Thank you, Madam. I think what the council is trying to do in the policy approach is provide as much clarity as possible and certainty on the key items of infrastructure that are required. So the P policy set out those key requirements that are seen as essential to delivering growth in that settlement. Deliberately, the wording says that contributions will be proportionate to those items of infrastructure because the settlements include a number of sites. And in accordance with the SIL regulations, we need to ensure that the contributions are fair and proportionate and directly related. So the intention is not that every site, as we've said, would provide towards every item of infrastructure. I acknowledge that there may be an inconsistency in the wording across the different P policies in terms of how that's set out, and we might need to look at that and amend that accordingly to make that clear. I think the intention is clear of the council. We deliberately haven't listed every single item of infrastructure in the P policies because, firstly, for instance, in the Epping policy, Part E makes it clear that reference must be given to the infrastructure delivery plan, which, as we know, is iterative and may change. Equally, policy D1 provides further backing to making sure that requirements are made proportionately and appropriately towards different items of infrastructure. And policy D1 should be read in accordance with the P policies and should link to the IDP. So it is fairly complex. I don't think it's appropriate to go to further detail in the P policies as to what is required, nor do I think it's appropriate to redraft Appendix 6 to set out specific requirements for specific sites. Because in some instances it's not possible to say at this stage exactly how much contribution should be made from each site towards each item of infrastructure until work is undertaken to underpin planning applications or concept frameworks or master plans. It's impossible to know for sure the exact contributions that need to be made. However, the work that the council has done to supplement the existing IDP does go some way to providing that kind of clarity. So it's fair to say we have further clarity, but it wouldn't be appropriate for that to go into policy. It's essential to retain some flexibility.
And so in relation to the items that are listed here as being key, is there sufficient confidence that those are definitely required, such that they can be put in policy, whereas others couldn't be and need to be left the IDP to be consulted?
Yes.
Thank you. A few final points on this. Mr. Dagley will go this way this time.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, the point I meant to raise was related to the Green Infrastructure Plan, which I know the Council are saying they're working on, because again, that's something that's a more general point, picking up Mr. Coleman's point there, that that can't be considered yet because it's not yet written, and who makes, which settlement makes what contribution. I pick up on that particular point that you raised just a moment ago under the wording under Epping on page 117 of the local plan, because under the D 6 on page 117 at the top there, it talks about appropriate provision of green infrastructure and open space throughout the settlement. Now, of course, that may or may not be possible in Epping, and it may be that the green infrastructure might be outside the settlement, so some of that very precise wording may not be suitable, and maybe a more general wording which covers also the green infrastructure plan, which is yet to be written, might be a way of tackling that and making sure that there isn't confusion between the general strategy, if you like, and the specific settlement proposals and contributions. Thank you.
Thank you. Till.
Thank you. Following on from Mr. Coleman, who said that the council was satisfied that all the infrastructure requirements listed in each policy would be required. Just looking specifically at P13, there are only two requirements, one of which is highway and junction upgrades, which I think is in every policy. But the recently published infrastructure delivery topic paper on highways and education doesn't identify any highway works that require contributions from the sites listed in P13 specifically. And therefore, I'm not sure whether the justification is there currently to have that in that particular policy, which is why, going back to the wording, whether it's more appropriate to have it if necessary or as necessary, rather than it being explicitly essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Hutchinson, then Ms Bryan.
Just picking up the same point as Mrs Hill, P12 similarly requires highways, junction improvements, and now we have, with the modifications, primary and secondary school places. In terms of the highway improvements, it's not clear, again, what junction improvements shearing sites are intended to give to those items. And in terms of primary and secondary school contributions, for the smaller sites, the council's current approach is that the smaller sites will not be expected to contribute to primary and secondary education, only to early years. So going back to the earlier point, the wording implies that those things are currently required to be contributed to by those sites, but that is not the case.
Thank you for that point. Ms Bryan.
My colleagues to my right have said much of what I wanted to say, but I think I appreciate the council trying to provide as much clarity as possible, but I think by listing these key requirements, which are inconsistent with some of the evidence base, it's actually leading to less clarity. And the amendment proposed by Ms Hutchinson to my right about a sort of overarching statement linking infrastructure requirements to the current IDP would probably be more appropriate and clearer than is currently drafted.
Mr Cook.
Yes, thank you. Having listened to the council's position on this, and in particular in relation to the suggestion of the individual policies listing key infrastructure requirements, my inclination is to say I think that approach is quite helpful. These are generally quite substantial infrastructure requirements that need to be flagged up at an early stage, such as new school provision, highways and transport improvements, wastewater, utilities, things like that, and also sometimes key infrastructure around green infrastructure and open space. So generally those are things that could be taken as relatively fixed in nature, and also flagging those up earlier is quite useful in terms of being transparent and helpful for a developer looking at the particular policy and individual requirements that apply to them. I would suggest that some cross-checking needs to be done with the infrastructure delivery plan, but inevitably some things change and some things may have slipped through the net. So certainly I think it's necessary to make sure that the IDP is comprehensive, but the suggestion of having these upfront requirements that we have good confidence will be required does seem quite useful to me in terms of the policy. So the approach that the council is advocating seems to me to be quite balanced and appropriate.
Thank you, Mr Cook. That's helpful. I think in terms of setting a way forward for now, obviously, as Mr Cook suggests, maybe a cross-checking is required and in relation to what we've heard over here. If there are things that are already known that are perhaps outdated in terms of your IDP work, then cross-check is required. But there does seem some merit in a case for keeping these specific items in the policy. However, If that's the case, and to allow for changes in circumstances, then I think you do need to look at the wording to provide some flexibility in there for if I think as the Epping one suggests, if the situation has changed, and also in order to clarify that not every development in that settlement will be required to contribute towards every single item of infrastructure. And then if that flexibility is there, then I think that provides a reasonable safeguard. Thank you. Okay. Now, I did ask a general question in the MIQs around the modifications concerning schools and sustainable transport, and these are essentially the addition of references to contributions to school places and cycle links, etc. Now, I've asked in every single session in every place session, whether those additions are justified, and I think we can cover them there, but it might be helpful just to have a quick response now as to whether there's a general piece of evidence that justifies all of those, and then it could be that in each session we're just able to say, does anybody disagree, rather than to have the same discussion 15 times. So if I just ask now whether the addition of references to school places and cycle links and the like is generally justified everywhere. That would be helpful. And then to point out, I'd also asked another general question about mapping, and I'm happy with the council's response to that, so I don't intend to cover that now. So could we just have a general response on whether the addition of school place requirements and sustainable transport requirements everywhere is justified, or whether we need to pick that up in the place-specific session?
In general terms, Madam, the answer is yes, it is justified by the evidence that sits behind the infrastructure delivery plan and the other work that's been undertaken. So our answer would be broadly the same for each question, for each settlement. We've been undertaking further work with the County Council to refine the specific education requirements and also to ensure consistency across those different requirements. Which is still ongoing, but we're close to resolving that. I'm sure the county will provide further clarification in terms of the justification for the education requirements. If I could come back to you on the movement and access point, or sustainable point.
Okay. I'm happy to pick it up in the place-specific sessions. It's just I don't want to have the same conversation 15 times. If you're going to say it's generally justified, then it's perhaps... And also I think we need to look at those in the context of the amendments that are going to be proposed around being flexible if those places are no longer required, or if a specific development doesn't contribute to them, then I think that's helpful. But perhaps when we come to the place-specific sessions, rather than have the same discussion lots of times, the council's position is that those are always that's justified, and we'll see if people take issue with that. Mr. Cook.
Yes, certainly I would concur with that view, that these requirements and listing them up front is generally appropriate. So I think we probably can cover off at least some, if not most, of the individual place-specific discussions, hopefully at this stage now. So basically, the County Council agrees that the requirements are important. I think in terms of the nature of why it's worth flagging them up front, is just worth me spelling out a little bit. In terms of the education requirements, those are critical requirements in terms of making sure there are sufficient school places available to accommodate local pupils as the need arises in a sustainable way and in a satisfactory way, bearing in mind educational requirements around things like educational choice. There's also the consideration around the sustainable transport requirements that have been highlighted as necessary in many cases here. And again, those are extremely important with a lot of factors in mind, including sustainable travel, trying to achieve a better sustainable modal shift in travel use, and also more active travel as well. So those are important requirements that need to be considered from the start and can be done so relatively easily. It's been touched on already that the evidence supports these requirements. These things are listed as far as possible within the IDP, and the policies concerned refer to the IDP. So, for example, in relation to specific educational requirements, those have been calculated as far as possible on the basis of the available evidence for each place so far, according to the number of homes that are generated and the pupil yield that is likely to result from that number of homes. Some further work would need to be done to refine those over the course of time, but we can have a reasonable clarity on what those requirements would be in terms of number of places at this stage. All these figures have been worked out according to standard methodology within Essex County Council's Developers Guide to Infrastructure Contributions, the reference for which is EB 1107. And as a result of all those things, the wording of the proposed modifications is considered appropriate and fit for the job. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on that as a general point now that can't be covered in the site-specific sessions? Thank you. Okay. Okay, moving on then to question 3. And this is the consistency between the flood risk and air quality clauses of the places policies and the respective DM policies, DM 15 and 22. And the general questions that have arisen is, are the policy triggers for requiring air quality assessments in the place policies consistent with the trigger in DM 22? Obviously, we haven't considered that policy in detail yet. And also, if you could just remind us maybe of the changes proposed to any flood risk clauses, and will they then be consistent with the requirements of policy DM 15? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. If I take flood risk clauses first, based on the statement of common ground that we've agreed, the Council's agreed with the Environment Agency and Thames Water, which is ED3, the Council did propose a number of amendments to the place policies in its Matter 4 hearing statement. And I refer you particularly to paragraph 74 and the table on pages 26 to 29, which sets those out. The Council considers that those proposed amendments adequately addressed concerns of any inconsistency. However, it should be noted that we proposed a similar amendment to P10 Nazing, which was included in the Statement of Common Ground, but was missed out from our Matter 4 and Matter 15 statements. And we do propose to include that amendment to Policy P10 in the same terms as we have for the other places policies. So that's except for essential infrastructure and water compatible developments. No built development on residential allocations will be permitted on land within flood zones 2 and 3, as shown on the Council's latest strategic flood risk maps, including the appropriate allowance for climate change.
Thank you. Does anyone have any comments on the flood risk clauses? Thank you. Okay, moving on to air quality. In relation to air quality, we do consider that the wording within the places policies for the Epping Forest Special Area of Conservation is consistent with paragraph 4.163 of the supporting text to policy DM22. The wording of that policy reflects the fact that other forms of development can potentially result in air quality issues arising from non-vehicle-based emissions. So we're not just considering the vehicle-based emissions. The Council's currently working with Natural England to agree a statement of common ground regarding a proposed amendment to Part B of Policy DM22 to provide greater clarity with respect to the air quality strategy for the Epping Forest Special Area of Conservation. And I know we're due to consider that matter at the hearing session next week. Again, any comments on that now that aren't reserved to the DM22 session? Thank you. Okay. Question 4. It's a slightly different topic here. Shortage of burial space in the district. This has been raised by a quite specific representation. And I think the Council's response to the question in my MOQ suggested that there was a shortage of burial space in several locations across the district. And so in light of that, my question now is, should the plan make specific reference to this and indicate how the situation could be addressed, or is this considered elsewhere outside the plan?
Thank you, Madam. I think I can provide a bit more or clarity. I think the open space strategy, which was EB 703, did state that the consultation indicated some shortages in relation to burial space. And Waltham Abbey in particular was identified as being in need of additional burial space. Just as by way of an update, planning permission was granted in 2017 for a 28-hectare woodland cemetery and erection of a meeting hall and associated buildings in Waltham Abbey. And a further application was submitted in April this year to vary that application to also include a crematorium. So we therefore think that additional capacity is being provided, certainly within Waltham Abbey. And we've also noted that Loughton Town Council have also identified a site as a possible future cemetery, and that was noted in the open space strategy document too. We do acknowledge that a further review, and that's set out in our Matter 15 hearing statement, paragraph 147, of available burial space and provision will be required, and the council is intending to coordinate with town and parish councils and other stakeholders to do that work. But we don't think that specific allocations are needed, because cemeteries would be considered to be appropriate development in the Green Belt, and policy D2 sets out the council's support for the provision of essential services and facilities where they meet an identified local need. And obviously it's also open to communities and parish councils to identify provision through neighbourhood plans, encouraging delivery of provision that way. And the council will continue to support town and parish councils with development of neighbourhood plans.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you. Number 5, again, another quite specific question. Does Stapleford Airfield have growth or planning related requirements which should be addressed through the plan? Again, this was in response to a particular representation raised. The council statement has sort of told me where that is and said its position is that it doesn't. I was almost just waiting to see if anyone else was going to tell me otherwise. No. No. Okay, thank you. Okay, did anyone else here want to raise any general matters that are applicable across the place's policies before we have a break and move on to Waltham Abbey? Now, just perhaps if I could ask you, Mr. Dagley, I know obviously you're here for this session and also other sessions. I just wonder when you're participating, how much if there's anything you feel you need to say, then do. But obviously we've got the HRA session next week, in which I do appreciate that there might be things that come up that then need to be translated back to the policies. So perhaps if you can bear that in mind, so that again we don't have the same discussion twice, and the council obviously hopefully have its specialists here for the HRA session. But I don't want to prevent you from saying anything, but if you can just sort of bear that in mind. Excellent, thank you. Okay, nothing more. So if we have a break, 15 minutes, is that okay? So if we come back at 5 to 11. Thank you. Okay, so it's 10:55, so we'll make a start now. Okay, thank you. We're going to make a start now. Thanks. So I think everybody knows who the council is. I don't intend to ask them to repeat who they are at every session unless anyone feels strongly otherwise, but I will go around the table for everybody else. If you could say who you are and your interest in the Waltham Abbey session. Thank you. Start here.
Jane Barnett from Savills Planning, acting on behalf of Crest Nicholson in relation to the Pickfield Nursery site in Waltham Abbey.
Good morning, Madam. Stephen Whale of Council, also on behalf of Crest Nicholson, and again in relation to Pickfield Nursery in particular.
David Sprunt, Essex County Council.
Rich Cook, Planning, Essex County Council.
Good morning. My name's Kevin Coleman. I'm from Phase 2 Planning, and we represent Louise Barr, who is the owner of site Wall R2. But in the spirit of landowner cooperation, I'm also here informally representing Manor Oak Homes, who are the interested party for Wall R1 and Wall R3 as well. So together, that's the North Waltham Master Plan area. And sitting alongside me, I have Jan Kinsman, who's from EFM. In our hearing statement, our Appendix 3, we attached a short note by EFM that Mr. Kinsman wrote in relation to education provision. And since you've asked a specific question on it, I thought it was appropriate to have Mr. Kinsman here to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Good morning, Madam. Tim Rainbird of Quad, representing Next PLC, who are joint applicants with Trinity Hall in respect of a live planning application on for employment development on the eastern part of allocation WAL E8 in Waltham Abbey.
Thank you.
Good morning, Madam. I'm Sam Metson from Bidwell's Planning, representing Trinity Hall, who are the landowners for site allocation WAL E8 and joint applicant for the application that's just been referred to.
Thank you.
Morning, ma'am. Charles Crawford of LDA Design, representing Land Fund, who have interests in sites south of Upshire Road. I'll be speaking principally on Greenbelt matters.
Good morning, ma'am. Stephen Kosky from Turley, still here from this morning's session, representing LF Waltham Abbey Limited, same site.
Thank you very much. So if we can just follow the agenda then in relation to the general matters first. And question 1. Now, I'd asked a question about Highways England concerns in relation to M25 junction 26. Now, from what I've read in the statements, it seemed to me that the concern might be specific to the E8 site. So if I could just perhaps ask the council to confirm the situation first of all, if that's correct, if you can clarify that these related to E8 and that it's capable of being addressed through the planning application process, that would be helpful. And obviously we have some representatives over this side. I guess I was trying to understand whether it's a general and ongoing concern or whether that has now been addressed.
Thank you, Madam. Just to set a bit of general context, we are in discussion with Highways England to agree a statement of common ground to support the local plan generally, and that will include matters in relation to junction 26 of the M25, and we're meeting with them early next week. As you know, the local plan has been underpinned by extensive highway modelling, which has been undertaken by Jacobs on behalf of the council in partnership with the county council as highways authorities. And the transport assessment report, EB 503, paragraph 12.6 and table on pages 70 to 72, sets out a package of mitigation measures which have been identified for junction 26. In relation to WAL E8, as we set out in paragraphs 103 and 104 of our hearing statement, Highways England have proposed that, subject to the imposition of 2 planning conditions, junction 26 can accommodate the scale of development proposed within the current application, which I should say is not yet been determined. So there are 2 conditions that they've asked us for about highway improvement works and a workplace travel plan. I can provide you more details, or we can provide you with more details, should that be helpful.
Is your understanding that the representation that had been made by Highways England centred on that site, or are there, as your understanding, any sort of ongoing concerns in relation to the development proposed in Waltham Abbey specifically?
Not as far as I'm aware in relation to Waltham Abbey specifically. We have a a draft statement of common ground, which we've been in discussion with Highways England. We are waiting for them to come back, but generally it's largely positive. There are a number of other issues around the district that they're also wanting us to be satisfied, but I think we will. I'm hoping by the transport session next week, Madam, that we will have something that we can share with you.
Thank you. If I could just come to the E8 people first of all, if you wanted to say anything about this, and then we'll go around.
Thank you. I think from our perspective, we did see the comments relating specifically to the allocation, or at least the allocation has been in part tested through the current planning application that we have running, which relates to an area of about 12 hectares on the eastern parcel of land and comprises 80,000 square metres of floor space. So the scale of development is beyond the indicative capacity within the policy, which is in part driven by the commercial requirement for mezzanine floor space, and it's a point we believe should be picked up in the wording of the policy in Appendix 6, as we'll hopefully come on to. But in essence, Highways England are now satisfied that the development does not have an unacceptable impact, in particular on the westbound off-slip of junction 26 and 25. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman.
Thank you. I'm a bit of an outsider to this conversation, obviously, because Trinity Hall have got their application running and the council are in conversation with Highways England. But my understanding of the situation was that when you look at EB 503, the transport assessment background report that was referred to a second ago, the table in there on pages 70 to 72 sets out the mitigation that's required in relation to the local plan development, so the local plan as a whole. And on that, for the M25 junction 26, it sets out what the mitigation required is, and it's basically four elements of localised works for Honey Lane and the M25 westbound on and off slips. And when you look at the plan that Trinity Hall provided you of the improvement works that they've agreed with Highways England, you can match up the four elements that are in EB 503 with the four sets of improvements on this plan. So in essence, this plan is delivering what EB 503 was requiring for the plan as a whole. So on that basis, it should address Highways England's concerns. Oh, once you've corrected EB to WB on this plan, which is something Highways England picked up, it refers to eastbound when it should be westbound on here.
Anyone else on the traffic question? No. Does the council want to come back on anything that's been raised?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. That's helpful. Number 2 is a modification proposed concerning Lee Valley Regional Park. The council's proposing modification to paragraph 5.5 and to policy P3 part F concerning pedestrian and cycling links to the park. Can the council confirm whether you've discussed those with the Regional Park Authority? Are they content with those amendments?
Well, they certainly made representations to us on that basis. I'm not sure that we've gone back to them on the precise policy wording that we're proposing. But what we're proposing is consistent with the wording that we're using in other parts of the plan.
Okay, anyone else on that matter? No, thank you. And number 3. Okay, again, this comes back to what we've discussed briefly already this morning, the modifications concerning school provision. Now, a modification is proposed to Part F of this policy to also refer to contributions towards primary and secondary schools, because at the moment it only says expansion of primary schools. Now, again, my general question this morning was, does the evidence justify adding secondary schools? And we heard from Essex County Council that it did, that the IDP generally justifies the proposed additions that are required. So my question, I guess, here is, does anyone take issue with that? Nope. Okay. Okay.
So very quickly, strictly speaking, no, we don't take issue with the inclusion of the word secondary schools, because as discussed this morning, and for Waltham Abbey, it's Part H of the policy, which is the rider to the infrastructure requirements that says, well, actually, although we're requiring these infrastructure improvements, we might decide later on down the line through the IDP that they're not required. And what you'll appreciate from what we've put in is that we're actually of the view that the secondary probably isn't required in relation to Waltham Abbey because of the surplus of places that exists at the moment. But that isn't a suggestion necessarily that the policy is wrong and shouldn't have secondary schools in the policy itself as a flag. It's just a note in advance to say that we're of the view that from what we've seen at the moment, it probably isn't required in relation to Waltham Abbey.
Thank you. Perhaps I could come back to the County Council on that point. And just if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit on what you said this morning. Is your intention just to sort of get those things that are often key in there at the moment, regardless of sort of what the evidence says at the moment, because it's something that always needs to be reviewed, or are you suggesting that these amendments are made because the evidence at present shows that there is insufficient capacity?
And it might sound like a slightly surprising answer, but it's actually both. Firstly, we'd suggest that these kind of requirements are flagged up and highlighted in principle as currently identified as being necessary, and it's worth getting those out there from the early stage to make sure developers are aware, and that the land requirements, for example, or the infrastructure planning requirements can be planned for in relation to new development so that it's done in a timely way. But the second part of the question is that the available evidence we have does tell us that these requirements, that secondary educational places are required. So yes, we are satisfied that that is certainly the case. And in this instance with Waltham Abbey, the growth planned for Waltham Abbey alone, 858 homes, according to the Essex County Council standard methodology, would generate something between 172 secondary school places maximum, down to a minimum of 86 secondary school places, and of course possibly somewhere in between, according to the form of development that eventually takes place in relation to houses or flats, because that's the determining factors. But it's clearly quite a substantial level of additional secondary school pupil yield that is likely to arise here, and with other factors including things like background growth as well, and the fact that sometimes pupils come in from other areas outside the priority catchment areas, then the County Council is certainly satisfied on the evidence that secondary school places, additional places, will be required.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman and then Mr. Kosky.
Yeah, so I think that gets to the point where we don't disagree with the policy, but we're clearly going to have a discussion further down the line, which is fine, which is part of the development management process.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman. Ms. Kosky.
It's a related point. I mean, obviously, you can see there, Ma'am, that there is a dichotomy between the two, the two bits of evidence that are presented. Mr. Kinsman will advocate that there is no requirement for a secondary school, and the County Council will advocate otherwise. But if we go back to the site selection methodology, and one of the key reasons why this site was chosen, if I take you back to EB 805, you can look at that at your leisure, Mum. But on page 47, the last bullet, Waltham Abbey, it said the site allocations were specifically amended and updated information provided and additional sites included to support the council's aspiration to encourage the relocation of the King Harold Secondary School to the north of the settlement. So there's a direct connection between the site selection methodology and the rationale for selecting a site of amalgamated land ownerships to facilitate this key piece of infrastructure which the County Council has told us is required. In policy, section F of P3, it says infrastructure requirements must be delivered. G, the council will seek the potential relocation and expansion of a secondary school in the local area, and they're very clear where that local area is, because under the Waltham Abbey North Master Plan section, it says that the strategic master plan should make provision for the minimum 610 homes and the expansion of a secondary school in the local area clearly being that site. Towards the end, it says, in accordance with Part F, the master plan should explore and support the relocation. So that goes back to what we were talking about this morning about the inconsistency in policy where there are requirements and then aspirations, and the council aren't very clear in this particular policy what it should be. But I go back to the genesis of why the site was chosen in the first place, and that was specifically to facilitate the relocation of this particular piece of infrastructure. And that is why additional sites were added, and this is why this particular spatial strategy was employed to the detriment of the green belt, which Mr. Crawford will talk about later, specifically to support this school. So the issue of whether or not secondary school places are required, and the evidence to support that, negates the whole reason why the site was chosen in the first place in the form that we see it presented. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we go on to the point of the relocation of the school? It's the second sort of question that I'd had. There is a modification proposed after paragraph 5.5, I think, to explain that Part G of Policy P3 reflects a local aspiration to relocate to the King Harold Academy. Now, my question was going to be, I know that the County Council doesn't object to that, but if the proposal is only aspirational at this stage, should the policy reference remain? But obviously we've now heard from Mr. Koski that there is a firmer intention for that in the master plan section of the policy under Part N5. So perhaps the Council could take us through that.
Thank you, Madam. Part G of Policy P3 does seek the potential relocation and expansion of a secondary school in the local area to meet the future needs arising from planned growth. Whilst the additional paragraph to the supporting text in paragraph 5.55, and that's the one that was set out in our hearing statements at paragraph 112, acknowledges that this is only an aspiration at the stage. The Council considers that it is wholly appropriate to include this is as a potential necessity if in the fullness of time the aspiration is demonstrated to be necessary, viable and deliverable. And as such, the Council does consider that it should remain within the policy.
So how does Part G, with or without the explanation in the supporting text, how does that link to Part N5? Because I'm not sure if I'm understanding correctly what Mr. Koski was saying, that at one level we have a sort of aspirational policy in Part G, and then a requirement for the master plan area to include the expansion of a secondary school in the local area.
I think the idea was to explore the potential expansion of the secondary school as part of the work on the master plan, and to provide for the potential on that site to include the make provision for that. But I think we recognise that that is subject to it being viable and deliverable, and that we could qualify that to make it clearer.
Mr. Cook, are you able to help us at all with the relocation proposals? Is it something that you see as essential or something that you're exploring?
Essentially, the County Council has made its position fairly clear here, and also as it's referenced, as just been mentioned in Epping Forest District Council statement, covered at paragraph 1.1, paragraph 112. County Council basically said, no, this is not a project that is on its own radar or is identified as necessary. We noted and described it, I think, probably quite helpful as what we understood to be a local aspiration, and we accept that if there is a particular local wish to do that, then we wouldn't necessarily object to that in principle. However, at this point in time, no particular work has been done with regard to this proposal. From that point of view, as the County Council sees it, the proposal does not appear to be deliverable nor essential. And I think it's on those where this really starts to fall down. So given those factors in background and the fact that Epping Forest District Council appears to be seeking to pursue retaining this reference, that is why the County Council suggested this explanatory wording to go with the paragraph to make it absolutely clear what the position is on this proposal if it is to remain in the local plan. And that is on the proviso that if it is to remain in the local plan, I leave it to yourself to judge whether that's appropriate, given what I've said about it not necessarily being particularly deliverable or achievable.
And in terms then of the need for secondary school places that you highlighted earlier, are there other ways that that could be delivered?
Certainly, yeah. The form of delivery of those extra school places has been identified by the County Council as taking place through an expansion of existing school or schools, and that's the way in which it can be done. The County Council has not identified that it is necessary to relocate the particular school concerned in order to achieve the delivery of those extra places.
Mr. Coleman.
Thank you. Well, I agree with everything that the County Council has just said, and I think the knock-on effect of that is that it's inappropriate to include a requirement in a policy for a piece of infrastructure that isn't needed. Whether or not you decide the Council's given you enough information to say that it's even worth keeping the aspirational text in the small print of the policy, or rather in the supporting text of the policy, is obviously another matter, but it can't be a policy requirement to deliver infrastructure that isn't required.
Before I come back to you, Mr. Koski, if I could perhaps ask the Council to address that point, but also perhaps come back on Mr. Koski's point as to whether the Part 5, so the sort of incentive, if you like, to relocate the primary school was a driver for the allocation of that site, and if the allocation remains justified if a school is no longer, or is not required upon it.
Thank you, Madam. If I deal with that final point first, we think it is justified. Part of the rationale for including an increased number of homes at Waltham Abbey was to support the regeneration of Waltham Abbey and support the town centre and its continuing vitality and viability. With or without the secondary school, provided the places are provided within the town, certainly we would still consider that was the best location for growth. It certainly was a local aspiration to have a secondary school, a new secondary school, because of the condition of the current school and its location, and to move it. And it was on that, with that in mind, and supported by the town council, that we that was a factor in why the quantum of growth was increased, to potentially support the aspiration to relocate the school onto a new site. So I don't think we're necessarily in disagreement with the county about requirement for places, but it's how the provision of places and increased places is made in the form of a new building, which would of course release that site. Yeah, my colleagues just reminded me that, of course, the school is an academy, and so that does also affect how development may or may not come forward, and that was why it was set in terms of a local aspiration.
Mr. Kosky.
Just a brief point, ma'am. So what we have is a very clear aspiration and a clear statement of intent in policy. We now hear that it's not deliverable, it's not viable, it was an academy school, so it was never going to happen. So just going back to my earlier query as to this site was specifically assembled in the form that we see it. Additional sites were added, were amalgamated at considerable penalty to the Greenbelt, which Mr. Crawford will explain, specifically to facilitate a school project which the council knew would probably be unlikely to ever happen. Would you please consider that and bear that in mind, that context, when you hear Mr. Crawford's evidence later? Thank you.
Okay, anything further on that now? We'll come back to it later on. Okay, thank you. Anything else on the general matters before we move on to the site-specific matters? Okay, well, we are coming on to the master plan area now in any case. Okay. The first simple bullet point on the agenda is, should site E7 appear in part M? Might just be a misunderstanding, or whether it's a typo.
The short answer is no, it should be deleted from part N. And you'll have seen from our Matter 12 hearing statement that we intend to remove the employment designation.
Okay. Okay, and what I've tried to do on the agendas for these sort of master planning type areas is just to give the council and any site promoters who are here the opportunity, as we did in the Garden Town session, just the opportunity first of all to give us a bit of an update with how work is progressing on that. So I'm happy for the council to begin, or for you to ask the site promoters to begin, however you see fit.
Thank you, Madam. Perhaps I'll just say a few words. The council consider that we're making good progress with the master planning process. Several meetings have been held between the key stakeholders, including council officers and the two site promoters, Phase 2 Planning and Manor Oak Farms. The site promoters are currently in the process of formulating the background technical information required in order to progress the production of the strategic master plan. As you're aware, both the site promoters and the council have signed and agreed a statement of common ground, which is ED 41. And the key points relate to an agreement that the site will be subject of a single master plan, and that the site is available, viable and deliverable, and will be progressed in accordance with the housing implementation strategy update and the trajectory contained with that in terms of bringing forward the site. Planning performance agreement is currently under discussion, and obviously that will set out the programme and the joint working to ensure the timely production of the master plan and the delivery of the development.
Mr. Coleman?
Only very briefly, just to conclude, there's 3 parties who are working collaboratively together. Manor Oak Homes and Mrs. Barr have agreed some joint instructions, some work they're doing separately. We are talking to the council about the PPA. We think we're very close to getting that signed, but we haven't let the fact that we haven't quite signed the PPA stop us from getting on with some of our background work. So we think we're good and ready to go.
Okay, so now the specific questions that I had on my agenda here were, first of all, the justification for requiring access onto Galley Hill, which is in part N6, and the widening of Galley Hill referred to in N7. Now, my understanding again is that the council has stated that N6 is not intended to preclude access onto parklands, and the site promoters have indicated that the master plan area can be appropriately served from Crooked Mile and parklands, and so they question the necessity of a link onto Galley Hill as required by N6. And they similarly question the need to widen Galley Hill as per N7. Is my understanding correct of the dispute? Okay, so if perhaps again we could ask the council to comment on those points.
Yes, certainly. The council does consider the requirement for access from the master plan area onto Galley Hill Road is necessary to adequately address the placemaking objectives that are set out in policy SP3. It will specifically facilitate the creation of sustainable movement patterns, including bus, pedestrian and cycling routes across the master plan area, thereby ensuring a comprehensive and coordinated approach is followed. The potential requirement to widen Galley Hill Road is based on advice from the County Council in their role as highway authority. What I would say, though, is that both those matters will be considered as part of the master plan process, and we will continue to have dialogue with the promoters of the sites to ensure that we come to a satisfactory arrangement.
Mr. Coleman.
Just to respond on the first bit regarding whether it's necessary to have a link onto Galley Hill Road. First of all, I apologise. I do need to correct myself because I said in my statement that Galley Hill Road was a no-through road, which is not true. I apologise. It's just that it becomes increasingly narrow and convoluted the further north you get up towards Claverhambury Road. But my main point in relation to that stays the same, which is there's no traffic reason or no highways reason for wanting to put all vehicular traffic onto Galley Hill Road. It doesn't particularly go anywhere, and because it's quite a narrow road as it goes further north, it's not necessarily a route that you would want people to go onto anyway. The council's response just now didn't give you a traffic reason for having Galley Hill Road as an additional access. Council cited 2 other reasons: sustainable transport links, like bus, basically a bus route through the site. Well, that can be equally achieved by a bus link from Crooked Mile through to Parklands, so that's not a reason for having a Galley Hill Road link. And secondly, pedestrian and cycle links. Well, again, that can be achieved without needing a link onto Galley Hill Road. So I think our point still remains the same, that there is no justification for requiring that link. And then in terms of the second point, which is there any need to widen or improve Galley Hill Road? If there's no vehicular link onto Galley Hill Road, then there can't be any reason to do any improvements on Galley Hill Road as a result of the master plan. because there's just no connection between the two. If there was a link onto Galley Hill Road, then I think, as we said in our statement, the only real effect that would have for vehicular traffic would be that less traffic would end up having to use the southern end of Galley Hill Road between that new link, the junction with Parklands. So all you get is less traffic going down to the Parklands junction, not more. So on the basis of the master plan, we can't see, A, any reason to have a link onto Galley Hill Road, or secondly, that having that link would actually necessitate any changes on Galley Hill Road itself. There is a separate issue, which is the employment site on the other side of Galley Hill Road, which it might be easier to come back to that when you get to that bit on your agenda as to the requirements for that site, or would you like me to deal with that now?
If you deal with it now.
Okay. So on the Wall E6 site, the employment site, you'll be aware that the vast majority of the site that's shown to be allocated is actually already consented and operational. In fact, over 70% of the area is in use already. The allocation only relates to a small extended area of about 1 hectare. And coincidentally, we've had an application running on 50% of that extra hectare, which went in last year. And the Highway Authority has come back on that application to say it has no objection on highway grounds, basically because the additional traffic generated by that small extension to the existing estate has no material impact on traffic flows at the southern end of Galley Hill Road. So we already have evidence that the Highway Authority doesn't require any improvements to Galley Hill Road, essentially for most of that extended area in their consultation and response on that application. So whether you look at the master plan area or you look at the Galley Hill Road industrial estate, either way, we're not seeing any evidence to say that there's any need to improve Galley Hill Road.
Okay. Thank you. So can I ask the council then if you could just expand on why you think it's necessary for placemaking purposes to have a link through the site onto that road, and whether, in response to what you've heard, you are putting forward any traffic reasons or traffic justification for that, and then indeed, given the nature of the road as being quite narrow, I've driven up that road, whether it would be desirable to put more traffic onto it.
I think as far as the traffic issues are concerned, I think my colleagues from the County Council will be better placed to address you on that point. In terms of placemaking, certainly when we did the initial work, there was our view that taking account of the advice from the County Council was that it would aid placemaking to have an additional access point onto Galley Hill Road and to widen it. As I've indicated earlier, those are matters which we're happy to discuss through the master plan process, and if it proves that an alternative arrangement is more appropriate, then we are happy to consider that.
Mr. Cook, or Mr. Sprunt, did you want to add anything?
I think we didn't identify any specific need for an additional access. Obviously, for a site of this size, 2 accesses would normally be sufficient. But we're happy, as been suggested, that these are sort of discussions that could happen further as part of the negotiations with regards to Section 106 and planning.
Thank you. In that case, could we perhaps look at the precise wording of the policy? I mean, are you concerned, Mr. Coleman, that the wording of the policy would commit you to those to an access there and to the widening? Is there a form of wording that perhaps could be agreed whereby the situation were looked at with placemaking and traffic and all of those things that we've heard about it in mind? And if that can be achieved without Galley Hill Road, then so be it. Is more flexibility in the policy required if those matters aren't actually specifically required at this stage?
Yes, so my original objection to part 7 of the policy was the specific absence of the word parklands, which you've already picked up on, and I think the council have responded in their hearing statement to say, well, yes, actually it could be parklands. So when you read the text at the moment, it only refers to Galley Hill Road and Crooked Mile, which is giving a strong indication that those are the places of access. I think if it were to refer to Parklands and Crooked Mile with potentially access to Galley Hill Road, then that would be a step in the right direction. As I say, we have reservations as to whether that's a good idea or desirable. I mean, obviously, the wording actually already refers to the potential need. So the word potential is in there already. It just seems to be in the wrong place. It should be linked to Galley Hill Road rather than a generic statement of potential access points.
And what's your feeling about the site shown on for the master plan area that sort of shows a link, if you like, onto Galley Hill Road?
I don't have an observation on it. I mean, that land forms part of the same parcel of land. So Wall R1, and actually just coming back to the council statement, they said the reason why Galley Hill Road and Crooked Mile have been chosen in the policy was because they were existing points of access. Well, actually, that slither of land that goes up to Galley Hill Road takes you to a field gate. That's the point of access the council was referring to. So in that sense, it's the right area of land because it's all part and parcel of one parcel. So I wouldn't suggest any change to the allocation boundary.
Okay, so coming back to the council, in light of what we've heard and in the absence of sort of a specific reason, if you like, for the link onto Galley Hill Road, would the council be amenable to considering an amended form of wording that sort of reflects the more flexible nature of that proposal?
Yes, certainly, Madam. Shall we talk to the site promoters and
Yes,
try and
please.
agree a form of words and come back to you?
Yes, please. While I've got you, Mr. Crawford, I'm looking at my map, Mr. Coleman, sorry, looking at my map from when I drove along here. I was just interested in the nature of the northern boundary to the site, which will come on perhaps to our Greenbelt discussion a bit later. Can you? There's obviously there's a tree line that I could see, sort of coming away from Crooked Mile at the north. Does the tree line go all the way across? What's the nature of the northern boundary of the site all the way across?
It's been a while since I've been there, I'll be honest. Okay. My recollection is that there is an established boundary along there. What the state of the vegetation is on north of Wall R1, I couldn't say.
Okay. There was definitely trees along it as far as I could see, but I just wondered how it went all the way across. Okay, well, fair enough.
Ma'am, if it helps at all, photograph 5, my photograph 5 in the appendix to our...
Sorry.
In the appendix to our statement shows a view from the hill looking across the site, and you can see that boundary on that photograph.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. So we'll come back to that. I want to just carry on with my agenda, and we'll discuss the Greenbelt issue before we leave this site. So surface water flooding is an issue that had been raised. So I note that the vulnerability of the area to surface water flooding is noted in Part N13, right? And perhaps the site promoters here could just give us some confidence that this is an issue that can be addressed.
Well, can I do that by taking you to 3 documents? Apologies. But hopefully they're ones that are already in front of you or reasonably to hand. One is Mr. Skosky's statement for matter 15, and specifically his paragraph 2.2, and the diagram that's below that.
You'll have to bear with me a minute.
Yeah, which
So
is
I've got them
should
all
look something like that.
Is this in the appendices or the main statement?
No, this is in the main statement. It's a diagram that's inserted in the main statement just after paragraph 2.2 on page... Oh, it hasn't got a page. I think it's about page 4 of your PDF.
Yep.
Second document is Appendix 3... No, beg your pardon, 2 to my hearing statement, which is the Canon Consulting technical note.
Okay.
So that also has some diagrams on it for surface water flooding, which look like this. And the third one, which might be harder to find, I'm sorry that this is a bit laborious, is Mr. Koski's original Regulation 19 submission from
Okay, well, I'll
Turleys,
look back
which
to that
also
one.
has these. And I'll just whiz you through to explain why I've taken you to those three documents. The first, the main reason for taking you to those three documents is that in Mr. Koski's hearing statement, paragraph 2.2 refers to identifying areas of high and medium risk of surface water flooding. But the diagram that's inserted below that has had the key removed from it. And the reason that's significant is that the diagram is not showing you the areas of high and medium risk flooding. It's showing you the areas of high, medium and low risk flooding. And the reason why I took you to the original Regulation 19 submission is that you can see the same diagram inserted in there, which does have the key on it, so that you can see the two diagrams are identical and they're both showing you the low risk situation as well as the high and the medium. If you want to see the high and the medium, you have to go to the Canon's note. And the reason why that's significant is that for, as you pointed out, in sequential flood risk terms, it's flood zone 1, there's no flood zone 2 or 3. When it comes to surface water flooding, which you're dealing with the overland flow routes for surface water crossing the site, generally the approach in flood risk assessments is you try and design around the high and medium risk areas, but the low risk areas are pretty much sorted out by either allowing overland flow routes within your design or otherwise your typical surface water SUD system picks up the areas of low risk anyway. So what I wanted to say, sorry it took me a while to get there, is that if you look at Mr. Koski's statement, that's not portraying you the correct position as regards the significance of flood risk on the site. What the Canon's note shows you is that there are areas of surface water flooding, which is basically water entering the site primarily from the higher land to the north and flowing through it. But it's very much concentrated on this sort of south-west to northeast alignment, which coincidentally is pretty much where the public footpath runs through the site. So although, strictly speaking, we haven't got that far in the master plan process in the sense we haven't published anything or gone out to consultation. We already have a pretty good idea that part of our master plan strategy will include a green corridor heading from the southwest to the northeast along the line of the public footpath and along the line of the existing surface water flow routes, and that's where we will be leaving green space which allows for the surface water to carry on through the site as it currently does, and that we can provide attenuation. So the upshot of all of that, and I apologise it's taken me a while, is that the situation is not as bad as Turley's would have you think, or not as significant. It coincides in any event with the area that we'd be providing green space within the site, and it's a situation that's perfectly addressable through the master plan process. Again, apologies for the length.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else on surface water? Mr. Kosky.
Thank you, ma'am. I won't take as long as Mr. Coleman. Just a few points there. I'll try and take them in order. First of all, I wasn't the author of the Reg 19 submission, so that wasn't my submission. Just a small point there. There was no conscious attempt to remove the key. It was an insertion. This is from Magic Map, and it was taken a snip just 3 weeks ago. It's the most up-to-date position. There's no attempt to deceive there. You can see by cross-reference with the Canon key exactly where the flood risk areas are. You can make your own judgment on that. But what the Canon report does tell us is that the underlying geology of the site is completely impermeable. And that's very clear in the flood management section of that appendix. And it says that the appropriate master planning will have a layout that avoids built development in the high and medium risk flood areas. So we've heard from Mr. Coleman that there'll be greenways, but I suggest that they should give every householder a free pair of Wellingtons if they want to use those greenways, because they're likely to be flooded most of the time because of the underlying geology is completely impermeable. So Canon's solution is that a modelling exercise is undertaken to better understand the surface flooding potential, and this will be done at the application stage. But of course the hidden danger there is that we don't know what the real implications are until after the allocation's been made with this minimum allocation. So what they suggest is the impermeable geology requires that a controlled surface water discharge regime is employed, and that inevitably is going to involve significant on-site storage to manage a storm with a 1 in 100 annual probability plus a 40% increase to allow for climate change. So considerable engineering works to store potential flood waters on site because of the impermeable geology. So it's rather academic, the marginal differences between the surface water flood extracted plan I put in my evidence compared to what's in the Canon evidence. I think Canon qualify their evidence quite clearly that an engineering solution is required, including not having any built development on those areas subject to medium and high risk of surface water flooding. Thank you.
Mr. Coleman.
More briefly this time. Obviously what Mr. Kosky's just read out is what the Canon report says, and what I'd say is that's perfectly normal. I mean, that's exactly the sort of consideration you'll expect on absolutely any development site, that you look to attenuate your flows, you provide your attenuation, having done the proper modelling at the application stage, nothing unusual, nothing untoward. The other reason, obviously, for showing you the original Regulation 19 assessment that Turley's did, I apologise, not Mr. Kosky, was that it also shows the same map for the piece of land that they're promoting, which also includes lots of blues on it, including particularly their access from Upshire Road. So I disagree that our Wellingtons need boots, but his residents would need 4x4s to go over the flooding that crosses his access.
Okay, a quick point from Mr. Kosky. I'll come to Council, then we'll leave that matter. Mr. Kosky.
I know I'm not allowed to talk about alternative sites, but that engineering solution to achieve a satisfactory access appears eminently achievable. That's a relatively straightforward engineering operation.
Thank you. Anything from the Council on surface water before we move on?
Only to say that we have within the implementation team our own drainage engineer who's looked at this matter and considers that the issues can be overcome through the design of the scheme and the master planning process.
Thank you. So the final bullet point on my agenda is, would the development of this site prejudice the glasshouse industry? And again, this is a concern raised by land funds. And Mr. Koski, if you want to start.
Thank you. I don't have too much to say on this particular point, other than there was a very substantial report, which I couldn't include as an appendix because it was so substantial. So for convenience, I put a link into the evidence, which you can look at your leisure, ma'am. But basically, the Lawrence Gord Partnership produced a report for the Council in 2012, which, just to sum it up in its basic form, looked at the importance of the glasshouse industry to this area of the country and showed the contribution it's made to the local economy and how that's declined significantly since 1951. And made specific recommendations looking at a key part of the district, including all of the area which is subject to this proposed allocation, and obviously the potential to assist the glasshouse industry, as this report recommends in that location, has been extinguished. And the report recognises that the landowners might not want to facilitate the glasshouse industry because obviously the land value of residential development is greater. But it's for the council to decide in the public interest and the benefits of the local economy, what the balance should be. Now, as I said earlier, we know this site was specifically conceived at the scale that it is, with its greenbelt impacts, with how it encompasses a greater potential for surface water flooding than a smaller site would on the same area. And it extinguishes any potential to assist the glasshouse industry in an area identified specifically by this report. All that sacrifice designed to facilitate a secondary school, which we know cannot happen, and probably was never intended to happen. It was just a mere aspiration. So again, all of that in the round, please take that into context when you hear Mr. Crawford's evidence. Thank you.
Before I ask whether anyone wants to comment on that, before I forget, just coming back to the secondary school point, is the dwelling capacity that has been attached to this master plan site, does that remain correct if no school were to be proposed?
Yes.
Why is that?
It's about the balance, and the balance of the homes would be a swap essentially. That if the homes don't come forward on there, they would be provided on the existing school site. So we're not looking to increase.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Coleman, on the glasshouse industry.
Yes, 4 points if I can. And I appreciate there's a bit of a crossover here because you're going to have a discussion, I think, also in relation to policy E3. So I've sort of got 2 points that are specific to Waltham Abbey and 2 that go on to the broader issue of the horticultural industry, if that's okay, because we're not at the other session. In terms of the sort of specific issues, looking at the Lee Valley Growers Association representation, which is their hearing statement for matter 12, just for clarity, they don't object to the Waltham Abbey master plan as a whole, and specifically I can see no objection to the Wall R2 site. Their objection is more geared around having both Wall R1 and Wall R3 allocated, and the suggestion that then landlocks their word Abbeyview Produce, which is the local firm there. So I think even if you were to come to some sort of conclusion that there is an issue here, it's just the point that it doesn't affect the master plan area as a whole. the objection is relating to certain parts of the master plan area. The second point, and again specific to Waltham Abbey, is I'm not sure, I haven't seen, and I've looked through the large document that Mr. Koski referred to, that there's any evidence in there specifically relating to Abbeyview Produce that there is any need for them to expand. There's obviously it's a generic document about the needs of the horticultural industry as a whole, but in there it points out that the minimum viable size, and this is on page 22 of the Lawrence Gould report, the minimum viable size for glass housing at the moment is 2.6 hectares, which is expected to rise to just over 6 hectares over the next 20 years. But having measured Abbeyview Produce's site, that's currently over 7 hectares. So I'm not sure that there's any evidence in the Lawrence Gould report, either specifically or generically, to suggest that there is a particular problem for Abbeyview Produce. And then the third point, which is a wider point, supporting the glasshouse industry is not a question of supporting every single business in the area. If there is a policy requirement, it's directed towards the glasshouse industry as a whole, not supporting each and every single business, because that would be an excessive reaction to the problem. And finally, fourthly, the council's obviously decided to move to a criteria-based approach, which logically would say that there is effectively more land that could become available for the horticultural industry because it's not being shoehorned into individual sites. But if you were to go down the line of saying, well, actually, there should be a return to allocating land for glass housing as well, it would have to be done on the basis of any other land being allocated, which is both, is it suitable and is it available? And what the 2006 alterations to the local plan have proved is that just by allocating land for glass housing without consulting the landowners is no way of making that land come forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Council on that point.
I don't think we've got anything to add to what's already been said. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? No. Thank you. Can I ask if there are any other comments that people want to make in relation to this allocation before we ask about the Greenbelt specifically? And anyone else, first of all, Mr. Koski? No? Okay. Go ahead.
Just a quick query, because we heard earlier that in the context of the progress of the master plan, meetings are being held, everyone's happy and moving forward. I couldn't see any evidence of any formal promotion or collaboration agreements when I looked at the land registry searches. Can anybody shed any light on whether there's any formal collaboration between the three separate land ownerships? Because Mr. Coleman's just alluded to the fact that the issues I raised with the glasshouse industry don't actually affect his site. So there was an issue there of a potential decoupling, and this is typical when you have multiple landowners on a given allocation that are not subject currently to any form of promotion or collaboration agreement tying them together. Because what will happen is the master plan will go forward, they'll all sign up to that, and then the applications will be very fragmented and be completely unrelated to each other, and will come in at completely different times, unless there is one overall master developer as part of a formal collaboration agreement. Be interesting to know if there's any evidence to support that, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Either Mr. Coleman or the council want to comment on that?
Yeah, just to reiterate the point I made earlier, which is we have a statement of common ground which has been agreed between the council and the parties, which agrees to the delivery of a coherent single master plan for the whole area, and to bring forward the sites in conjunction with what's set out in the housing implementation strategy.
Mr. Coleman.
Sorry, just to add one further point to my colleague. There's also the policy requirement in the plan that requires applications to come in general conformity with the master plan that's been endorsed. So that's the way the council will safeguard against separation.
Thank you. The other Mr. Coleman.
Thank you. What I said a minute ago was that the Lee Valley Growers Association representations don't affect the master plan as a whole. I think Mr. Koski's overinterpreted that as a decoupling. But in terms of the landowners themselves, so Manor Oak Homes have an interest in both Wall R1 and Wall R3, and my client, Mrs. Barr, has an interest in the other. So there are effectively two parties involved, not three. They are working collaboratively. Whether or not that leads to a formal agreement in due course, I think is effectively their business at the moment. I don't see any problem in working towards providing them a master plan that meets the council's requirements.
Thank you. If we can move on now to the Greenbelt issue that Mr. Koski wanted to raise. Now, I don't have any particular. I do in some cases in other settlements, but I don't have any particular questions in relation to the Greenbelt matters in Waltham Abbey. So, if Mr. Koski, if you want to raise your concerns in relation to the master plan site now, but we'll leave any other concerns in relation to Greenbelt till later on. Mr. Crawford.
I'm going to defer to Mr. Crawford.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, I have a few points to make, if you'll allow me. Can I just start by checking that you have the 6 figures, or perhaps asking you to check in due course the 6 figures that were appended to our statement, because they were submitted via a download link. So if it turns out there's any difficulty with those, if the programme officer could let us know, we'll get them through to you. But there were 5 photograph panels, and then a plan showing my assessment of the area that is appropriate for Greenbelt release.
Just hold them up a minute. Oh, you've got a copy. Yeah,
There are
okay.
5 photograph panels of that nature.
Thanks. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. So the comments in relation to Greenbelt in our statement are couched in terms of Greenbelt Purpose 3, safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. There is also an overlap with Purpose 1 about sprawl and, to a degree, Purpose 4 about the setting of historic towns. As a preliminary point, in our Matter 4 statement, we criticised the Council's approach of excluding consideration of Purpose 3. In short, there's no policy basis for excluding it. The best available good practice guidance on Greenbelt is the PAS guidance, Planning Advisory Service guidance. And in relation to Purpose 3, it says, presumably all Greenbelt does this, making the purpose difficult to use to distinguish the contribution of different areas. However, it continues, the most useful approach is to look at the difference between urban fringe, land which is under the influence of the urban area, and open countryside, and to favour the latter in determining which land to try and keep open, taking account of the types of edges and boundaries that can be achieved. So there's no basis for excluding consideration of Purpose 3, and frankly, it's absurd to ignore it simply because it's inconvenient. The Council's own study points out some self-contradictory implications of excluding it, and the reference for that is paragraph 5.16 of our Matter 4 statement, where we pointed to those. So if I could make 3 points from our Matter 15 statement in relation to Purpose 3, the first one being that sites R2 and R3 have strong existing urban influences on them, whereas by contrast, most of R1 has a strongly rural character. So therefore, there's already been a significant degree of encroachment on R2 and R3, but not on most of R1. The second point is the ridgeline, which runs from Breaches Farm northwestwards. It's probably the single main element in the rural setting of the town on the northern side. It gives a strong sense of rural landscape in proximity to the town. And if development starts to encroach on the lower slopes of that ridge, there will be a substantial loss of that rural context, whether that's seen looking outwards from the town or in views from the countryside towards the town, such as my photograph 5 that I referred you to earlier. So that rising ground affects much of parcel R1. The third point is that because of its rural character and the lack of a strong natural boundary, R1 has a continuity with the wider countryside. And therefore, if R1 is released and developed, that will increase the urban encroachment onto the adjacent land that would remain in Greenbelt. And that would then mean there is little reason to prevent a subsequent development of the next fields further up the slope, which then becomes urban sprawl. So my conclusion is that R2 and R3 can be released without significant greenbelt harm, as indeed could the southwest corner of R1, but that to release the majority of R1 would cause substantial greenbelt harm, and we say therefore it shouldn't be released. And I'd point out that the council's own assessment says that their greenbelt parcel 68.3, which includes R1, they assess that as a very high level of harm, which is the highest level of harm in their assessment.
Sorry, Mr. Crawford, is that in relation to Purpose 3 specifically?
No, that's, forgive me, that is, yes, that includes Purpose 3 in the council's assessment. That's on the basis of all 4 purposes. They assess it as a very high level of harm.
And when you exclude Purpose 3? I'm just making sure that I've got the right sort of summary, if you like, from the council.
Yeah.
Because I think...
you'll forgive me, I'll have to find that.
So I'm just trying to see how much it turns on Purpose 3, I suppose, for my consideration, because I think the council's indicated that Alteration 8, which is 1, 2, 3, T1 and E6, would have no or weak contribution to Purposes 1, 2 and 4. So it's a Purpose 3, if that's correct, it's Purpose 3 issue.
In the council's assessment, Purpose 3 is the key purpose.
Okay, thank you.
They assess for parcel 68.3 no contribution to Purpose 1, weak to Purposes 2 and 4,
okay.
and strong to Purpose 3.
Thank you.
That's correct. So our figure 6, which I referred to you to in our statement, shows what we consider to be the appropriate greenbelt release. You mentioned, ma'am, you've visited the site. I don't know whether you have actually walked the footpath across the site. I would encourage you to do so if you can, to enable you to consider the points I make in the statement. And by way of comparison, I would also encourage you to look at the Land Fund site south of Upshire Road, because the comparison in terms of greenbelt criteria is quite interesting. That's a site that has strong urban influences across the whole site, unlike R1. It also has land that rises away from the urban edge, but in that case, the rising land is much closer to the urban edge, and it's part of a smaller, more local topographical feature rather than the prominent ridge which dominates the north side of the town. And also in that case, the combination of topography and vegetation creates a strong natural boundary on the edge of the site, which R1 doesn't have. So that is the reason why our view is that there would be only modest harm in the case of the Land Fund site, whereas for most of R1 it would be substantial. If I could just make one final point, which is about the definition of greenbelt boundaries, because the extent we show on our figure 6 includes, as I said, the southwest corner of R1, so it would draw the new greenbelt boundary across an open field where there are no existing features. And you'll of course be familiar with paragraph 85 of the 2012 NPPF, the final bullet, which says that greenbelt boundaries should be defined clearly using physical features that are likely to be readily recognisable and permanent. In a situation where greenbelt boundaries are being altered, that doesn't mean you have to draw the new boundary along existing physical features if the reason for the alteration is to enable development which will itself create recognisable permanent physical features. As an example of that, there are several examples at Cambridge. Probably the best is Addenbrooke's Road on the southwest edge of the city, where the Glebe Farm area was released from Greenbelt. The new Greenbelt boundary was drawn across open fields, but a new urban edge has been built which creates a very clear long-term Greenbelt boundary. And there are other examples in Cambridge as well. So just in case that was a question lurking in your mind, I wanted to address that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take Mr. Whale, and then if I can ask the council if they want to come back on that, and then I'm keen to move on to the other sites now as the time's going on. There's people that want to say things about the other sites. So, Mr. Whale.
Yes. Well, forgive me, Madam, because I'm not quite clear if you're at point 4, 5, 6, or 7. I've only got 2 real points to make. Your point 7 is probably the logical place for me to make them.
Okay. Well, let's move on, and then we'll make them there.
By all means.
Thank you. Would the council like to come back on the Greenbelt point that's been made?
Just very briefly, I think we've already explained the reasons why the council did the Greenbelt assessment in the way it did, and excluding Purpose 3. And also, we've previously made the point that Greenbelt was only one of the considerations when determining which sites to propose for allocation. And I'd just draw your attention to Appendix B 1.5.2, which is of the site selection report, which looked at the strategic options and why this was the northern expansion, and this area was seen to be the more suitable strategic option, and particularly in relation to proximity to the town centre, transport and community facilities being key considerations.
Thank you.
I'm sure I can find you what the EB reference is. It's EB 805I.
Aye. Thank you. Okay.
Sorry, and it's page B785. Sorry, it's page B785.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to leave the master plan site there now because I'm keen to move on to the other points on the agenda. So turning to the other residential sites, 5. Obviously, I'll go through them as they are on my agenda. If there's anyone here that wants to comment, then you can once my question has been answered. So R4 was in the fire station was a heritage-related question, and a modification has been proposed to Appendix 6 in relation to R4 and R5 to make reference to the Waltham Abbey Conservation Area and note that it's on the Heritage at Risk register. This was a concern raised by Historic England. If the council can confirm whether Historic England is content with that.
Yes, Madam, that's included within our statement of common ground with Historic England, ED 24, and it's their reference 14.
Did anyone here want to comment on R4? No, thank you. I didn't have other questions on that. So turning to R5, the community centre. So 2 modifications are proposed here. There's a modification proposed concerning on-site parking for residents. Now, this is to clarify that on-site parking should be limited to that required to service the essential needs of the development. I was wondering if the council could just explain what that meant.
Yes, Yes, in conjunction with our requirement in policy T1 to reduce the amount of parking, we are wanting to ensure there is sufficient residence parking, but it should be limited to that required to service the essential needs of the development, i.e. for badge holders and for servicing, and that we should make provision for visitor parking or car sharing, carpooling arrangements, but not potentially at the levels of car parking which historically have been required, and that we would, as part of that, seek contributions towards implementing controlled parking zones in the vicinity of the site. That's similar to what we're seeking elsewhere in policy terms on other sites in the district.
Thank you. In light of the in light of that, did you want to comment on the concerns that have been raised in terms of pressure that any residence parking spilling onto neighbouring roads is likely to have?
Well, I think that's the idea of having controlled parking zone and not giving parking permits to the new residents of the properties within that parking zone in order to ensure that there is satisfactory arrangements for existing residents.
Thank you. And a modification is proposed in relation to the capacity of the site. The council now considers that the plan overestimates the capacity for 67 dwellings and that this should be 53. Perhaps if I could just again ask the council to explain its reasons for that, but for everybody else's benefit, it results in a number of necessary modifications which are set out in its Matter 15 statement, and it includes amending the boundary, is that right?
Yes, that's right. I think the reason for the capacity site being reduced is because we've identified some of the land as being highway land, which isn't available for development.
Before I ask my last question, since I've written this, having been to the site, does anyone want to comment on either of those modifications or anything else in relation to the community centre? No, thank you. So obviously, when I went there, I just noted that it's obviously in current use as a community centre, and there was a preschool and things. Do you want to say anything about the arrangements or what's happening to the current uses? Is that something that's being considered?
It certainly was considered at the time of the allocation. I'm sorry, but I don't know what the up-to-date position is. If you would like some more information, we can come back to you on that. Yeah, the existing provision of the community centre is assumed as part of the redevelopment of the site. As you will have observed, it's not in fantastic condition, and so part of the proposal for the scheme was to improve the facilities there.
Thank you. Nobody else? Okay, thank you. Any comments on any of the other residential or traveller sites that we haven't mentioned so far today? So I think that's R6, R7 or T1. No. Okay, so moving on then to number 6, employment sites.
Madam, if I may just come on WAL R6 just to say that WAL R6 is available, viable and deliverable, and it's currently the subject of pre-application discussions. So we think, in fact, it may come forward earlier in the plan period than currently projected in the Housing Implementation Strategy update, which says that it may not come forward until 2028-29. But we consider it may well be delivered earlier.
Thank you. Okay, so employment sites. Okay, so first then E6, the Galley Hill Road Industrial Estate, and E8. So obviously we have people here representing site E8. If we can just first of all cover the modifications that are proposed in relation to those sites, and then I know you had something else you wanted to talk about in relation to your allocation. So a modification is proposed to Part D of the policy, and the addition of a new Part E concerning B uses. And I think this is to clarify that the newly allocated part of E6 is intended only for B2 and B8 uses, and that E8 is intended for B1, C, B2 and B8 uses. If I could perhaps ask the council to just explain that modification first of all. Thank you. Ms. Coleman.
Thank you, Madam. So yes, as set out in our hearing statement, which is paragraph 126, the council intends that while .E6 is allocated for B2, B8 uses. To clarify this, we have produced an amendment to policy P3, and to assist examination, we have produced an employment note, which is Appendix B to the council's Matter 12 hearing statement. So I appreciate that won't have been seen by many so far. The note, which is the Appendix B, consolidates a number of proposed amendments which are referred to, which no doubt we'll be referring to this week within hearing statements, and also a number of further amendments which we are proposing essentially to make the approach to employment sites consistent throughout the plan and to provide further clarity in relation to employment matters. So the amendments are essentially, in this instance, to clarify, as you said, the intention for the designated part of the site, the existing site, and the new allocation, the further part of the site. We also propose amendments to some of the supporting text, paragraph 5.53 and 5.54, again to ensure consistency in referring to employment site allocations. So that's to make clear what is allocated, to put it into hectareage as opposed to floor space, and to make clear for the further allocation at WAL E8 that's 10 hectares as opposed to 40,000 square metres. So essentially it's about ensuring consistency in approach and making it clearer what is an existing use that's designated and what is an extension to that existing use, and therefore what use that's allocated for.
Is there likely to be any controversy over clarifying what use is allocated, what it's allocated for? That seems to be the most significant change, I suppose. Where did those proposals come from?
We don't believe so. That's come from the evidence base, the employment land assessment work that was undertaken. I can give you a reference if that's helpful. And essentially, we're not really significantly changing anything that was already set out in the plan. It's just making it clearer. So, in the supporting text to the policy P3, for instance, paragraphs 5.53 and 5.54 already made clear in the text the current use of the existing sites, and so we're not actually introducing new material.
Thank you. Okay. Did you want to comment on those changes and anything else you wanted to say in relation to E8?
That would be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, we support the council's proposed modification of 5.54 to delete reference to 40,000 square metres. I guess in the context of Appendix 6 more widely, our concern relates to the provision of mezzanine floor space and the interpretation of the approximate net capacity of the site to deliver, again, 40,000 square metres in Appendix 6, which we just think should be clarified to exclude mezzanine floor space. Our proposal is 80,000 square metres, of which more than 50% is mezzanine space, and we wouldn't want the specifics of the policy to be interpreted to allow less floor space on the site. Modern requirements of operators now need mezzanine space as part of their logistics operations, which certainly my client's operation is geared towards. That's in the context of the quantum of development. Again, on Appendix 6, the text regarding...
Can we just get to... Oh, okay, so it's page 88, is that right? So if you can just go specifically to the wording you're concerned about.
Yes, so on-site constraints, first paragraph, second sentence, it effectively talks about sensitive land uses and the fact that design and layout should bear that in mind. The site isn't allocated for any sensitive land uses, so in the interest of removing this ambiguity, we think that sentence should be deleted. Effectively says development proposals should be subject to careful design and layout and ensure that where sensitive land uses are proposed, they accord with the requirements of the HSE's land use planning methodology. It doesn't seem to be relevant to this particular site. The gas main is also some way off the site boundary, but it seems to me to be inconsistent with what the allocation is for.
So just to be clear, you think that in relation to on-site constraints, development proposals should be subject to careful design and layout and ensure that where sensitive land use types are proposed, they accord with the requirements, etc. That sentence isn't required.
I believe so, yeah.
Can you put your microphone down a bit? Sorry, can you just
Sorry,
explain
yes.
why that is again?
Because the allocation is not for sensitive land uses, so it seems inappropriate to reference those within a policy for B1C, B2, B8 uses.
Okay.
The final point.
Hold on, well, let's ask the council about that.
I think I appreciate the point, but I think what this is saying is that the development has the potential to have an impact. The land use may have an impact. So I'm not sure that I would agree that it needs to be deleted. I think it's more about how that's applied, and if it needs to be made clearer, we can certainly look at it.
Okay. Can we ask the council to do that? Carol, sorry.
Thank you. The final point deals with infrastructure, again on Appendix 6. It refers to the need for restrictive operational controls which could undermine, in our view, the deliverability of the allocation. So in particular, the sentence, as part of a routing management plan, the need to restrict the hours of operation for heavy goods vehicles to avoid the critical peak network periods should be considered. So again, the site's allocated for a range of employment uses, or all of which, or a lot of which, including my clients, requires a 24/7 operation, and in particular they require flexibility for servicing movements. So Highways England, in assessing the impact of the application, hasn't concluded that such controls are required, and we therefore ask that that wording in particular is deleted. Restriction on hours, such as that set out, would be very onerous for future occupiers, which could undermine the deliverability of the allocation. And for those reasons, we'd ask that that sentence is deleted.
Just in relation to the last point that was just being made about the routing management plan, the council would say that it is very important that we retain that control. There have been lots of concerns from an existing distribution centre in the same locality in the use of Stewardston Road in particular, and we would want to ensure that that any routing of vehicles, particularly in peak hours, does not use that route. And we also obviously have to take account of the issues to do with the Epping Forest Special Area of Conservation and the need to ensure that vehicles don't use that route. Yeah, and I think it's also important to recognise that the planning application which is currently under consideration is only for part of the site and not the whole site.
Thank you. Could we just go back briefly to what you were saying about the site size at the beginning, about the mezzanine floor? I just wanted to hear the council's views on that. Again, can you just point to specifically where you're concerned about in Appendix 6?
The reference to the approximate net capacity within the first page.
Okay.
Just to clarify, Madam, that will be amended. So the intention is to remove all reference to square metre capacities from Appendix 6 and from the plan, and consistently refer to land area, which I think gives the flexibility that's been requested. So that will be made consistent in Appendix 6 and in the plan itself.
And that would address your concern?
Yes, thank you, it would.
Thank you. Thank you. Anything else on E6 or E8? Mr. Coleman.
E6, if I may. I think I understand that what the council's suggesting is that the developed part of the site would be allocated under E1, and it's only the undeveloped part of the site that then falls into the land uses in P3. I stand to be corrected on that. I confess I've not read the council's Matter 12 statement, but I don't think that changes anything. So as I understand the position for the existing part of the site, which would fall under policy E1, the wording as proposed to be amended that's set out on page 56 of the council's statement says that it would be for B-class uses and sui generis uses of an employment character. And that's fine. What we particularly have on Galley Hill Industrial Estate is a number of scaffold merchants which have been tended to be classified as sui generis in the past. And that's where our comments originally came from. So that's all fine. But then in relation to the extended area, the remaining 1 hectare, as I understand the council's amendment on page 54, that would only be allocated for B2 and B8 uses. So my question is, what's wrong with a B1C use on the extended area, and what's wrong with a sui generis use of an employment character? I'm not quite sure why the extended area is being given different land uses to the main existing area.
Mr. Coleman.
I think I'd need to review the detail, Madam, and come back as to why that's happened. Certainly the intention of amendments to policy E1 is to ensure that employment uses of a sui generis nature can be incorporated and can be protected on existing sites and on new allocated sites. In terms of the actual usage and whether B1C is applicable, I'd need to double check and confirm.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Okay, are there comments that people want to make on the other employment sites that we haven't mentioned so far, E1 to E5 or E7?
Sorry, can I just have an opportunity of coming back on the routing management plan and the council's comments in particular? So I maintain the view that we don't think reference to restricting the hours of operation is relevant, or rather it is too prescriptive insofar as it could detract from the scheme. So could perhaps the wording be watered down to refer to the routing management plan needing to consider the wider impact of heavy goods vehicles on the network? It seems to be, it could be beyond restrictive hours that the control seeks to afford. Reference to those hours are a concern to us.
I think we need to come back to you on a proposed rewording of that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So nothing further on those other employment sites. Okay, so moving on now to Greenbelt alterations, not to come back to the one we've already discussed. Okay, now, as I said, I haven't got any specific questions on these. If we let Mr. Whale go first.
Thank you, Madam. That's kind. Do you happen to have my client's hearing statement either to hand or available on your laptop?
I might do. In relation to this matter?
It might just help you and save some time.
Have you got your your reference number? It would help me.
One.
0106. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was really going to invite you to the map, which is at Appendix 1, because if you're able to go to that, it's after page 8, I think.
Yep.
That might, as I say, be convenient and save some time. So the hearing statement makes two essential points, and I'm going to obviously focus on those and do it briefly. The first relates to Nolly's Nursery, which I'll call R8, and the second point relates to Pickfield Nursery, which I'll call R9. I think it's fair to say the R8 point is the easier of the two and the quicker of the two. Just to recap, Nolly's Nursery was given planning permission about 3 years ago for residential development, and it's been built out. And the short point is that in terms of map 5.6, we say obviously it should come out of the green belt. Frankly, I don't think I need to say any more on that subject. The second point relates to Pickfield Nursery, and again, I'm not going to rehearse the entirety of the background. Cutting to the chase, in terms of the first Greenbelt assessment at stage 1, Pickfield Nursery was included within the same parcel as R1, R2, R3, T1 and E6, and collectively their Greenbelt contribution was deemed to be weak or relatively weak, and it was the only parcel around Waltham Abbey given that particular ranking, and it was identified as a broad location for further consideration. And then we came on to stage 2, and unfortunately Pickfield Nursery was lumped in, if I can use that lay term, so to speak, within parcel 068.1. And in terms of results, and Greenbelt harm, the impact was said to be the same as R3, obviously one of the proposed allocations. So as I say, a lumping in, but nonetheless, same result as one of the proposed released sites. But in fairness, there was some discrete consideration of a particular parcel, which is plainly and obviously Pickfield Nursery. And that bespoke assessment undertaken by the council concluded only limited harm to the Greenbelt purposes if my client's site was released. And you'll know from the hearing statement, and indeed from other hearing statements earlier in the examination, that the client's undertaken its own assessment and finds the site contributes only in a negligible way to the Greenbelt. And so the upshot, when you put all of that together, in terms of a residential allocation of Pickfield Nursery, is there'd be less harm to, less impact on the Greenbelt than R1, R2, R3, T1 and E6, all of which are proposed for allocation, of course. So there's an inconsistency there. And if you go back to the map I directed you to previously. When one looks at the master plan area, we see those there, T1, R1, R2, R3. We read across to the right, we have E6, and then we jump over our site for the moment to R8, the Knowles Nursery. You can see that allocating R9 Pickfield Nursery would be consistent with that pattern as shown on the map. And of course, R9 has the clear boundary of the Cobbins Brook on its northern extent. And when I appeared previously, I took you through the work that had been done to show that there's no flood risk issue, agreement having been reached with the Environment Agency. And to compare and contrast perhaps with some of the other allocated sites, Pickfield Nursery, there are no upfront infrastructure requirements of any materiality. There are no access constraints of any issue. And the allocation, as I said, of the site would provide for more even distribution across the north of Waltham Abbey. A couple of additional points just to conclude what I have to say. The last part of the hearing statement, if you just go to the end of the text at 1.27 and 1.28, that just picks up on one or two points that were made at the Matter 5 hearing session by Ms Salisbury of Arup. We have looked at the site selection reports and we can't see anywhere in those reports where the errors that we have identified have in fact been addressed by the Council. My final point, and it goes back to a point you made earlier today, Madam, you said, understandably, given how much work you have to do, you haven't yet had a chance to visit all of the proposed allocated sites. And again, it's just to extend the invitation we've made earlier to you to visit our site, which we think you would find helpful, and indeed we would urge you to visit it when you can fit that in. So that is, I hope, a fair and brief summary of the two essential points in the hearing statement, all of which militate in favour of allocating Pickfield Nursery. The context, I suppose, for those submissions is the bigger picture about housing numbers in the plan, obviously for Waltham Abbey in particular. That's our particular concern. Ms Barnett can address you on those if you so wish. Obviously, I think we've probably had that discussion already. But, yes. But yeah, I appreciate the point that you're making. Very well. Well, you'll have heard and read all of that previously. So thank you very much indeed, Madam. Thank you. Did the Council want to come back specifically on those points?
Yes, thank you, Madam. In relation to Pickfield Nursery, as you've heard, flooding was the determinant issue in deciding not to take this site forward. And the Council has engaged extensively with the site promoter in relation to this matter. We understand the promoter has undertaken further work, and the Council has sought clarification from the Environment Agency in relation to whether the flood mitigation measures proposed alter the extent of flood zones that were used to inform the production of the plan. And we received a response from the Environment Agency which confirmed they do not consider that the extent of flood zones should be altered in light of the further work which was undertaken by the promoter. So that doesn't alter our rationale and reasoning which is set out in the site selection report. I refer you to B786 on EB 805I again, which sets out the reasoning why that site wasn't taken forward. In relation to Knowles Nursery, I don't think you will have yet seen the homework note that we've produced in terms of green belt anomalies, but that has been sent to go up onto the website, and that was in a request to look at whether there were any other green belt anomalies. In relation to this, in respect of Waltham Abbey, that note identifies additional area of land which the Council does now propose to remove from the green belt, and that is the Knowles Nursery site. This site was granted planning permission in 2016 for the redevelopment to provide 79 dwellings. although it was deemed to be inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, very special circumstances outweighed the harm. The development is now largely built out and therefore constitutes a significant anomaly in the Greenbelt. The development site's on the edge of the existing built-up area of Waltham Abbey and benefits from a high degree of containment. And so we are proposing now to alter the Greenbelt boundary in this location to remove Nolly's Nursery. And obviously that will also require an amendment to map 2.5, which is the Greenbelt boundary alterations, which is shown on page 50 of the local plan, and a consequential amendment to the policies map.
Mr. Wales, do you want to come back on that?
Well, thank you. Yes. Well, plainly, I'm cheered by what has been said about Nolly's Nursery. In terms of Environment Agency and flood risk, we covered this in an earlier part of the examination. The EA correspondence attached to our matter 5, I think it was, hearing statement, is absolutely clear. Frankly, there is no flood issue.
If it's helpful, Madam, we can supply the correspondence that we've had from the Environment Agency on this point.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay, anything further on any of the other Greenbelt alterations or indeed anything else in Waltham Abbey? No. Thank you. Okay, so we'll end the session now, back at 2 o'clock for Epping. So thank you very much for your contributions.